person?
Hmm.
Can they pay their taxes? Can they show
Right.
up on time? Can they be responsible, relatable? That's the fine art. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's can you have a casual conversation while you're waiting in line? And not everyone has to be an extrovert, but the idea is that Judaism is a householder tradition. It is for
Hmm.
people with families and or at least dependents. They're people who have jobs that are mystics traditionally, almost across the board. Or
Right.
people with dependents who had responsibilities. They weren't monks. We don't have monks in Judaism. So it is inherently an embodied path. It's something that requires presence and like literally showing up. You might be able to teach a class or lead a meditation, but your spouse probably has a pretty good idea of who you really are.
Yeah.
and
Right.
and all those kinds of things. So it's essentially, can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we be in the world and simultaneously connecting to the profound and the transcendent?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you are watching or listening. This is the Holistic Monitor, and I'm your host, Nick Sconia. The Holistic Monitor is a wellness podcast featuring life energy research, health and wellness transformation, self-improvement and empowerment, philosophy, spirituality, and now guest interviews as well. We look forward to your comments on our YouTube channel at Holistic Monitor, and you can also listen on the go with us at Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, and more. And with that, let's get today's show started. Rabbi Matthew Ponak, you have written a book, The Embodied Kabbalah. And you have studied Kabbalah how long?
I guess it's been about 21 years.
Wow. Okay. That's a long time. This is a life pursuit for you?
Yeah. Well, so far,
Yeah.
I'm open to the unfolding, I think, like any good student of Kabbalah should be.
Right.
But it seems like this is a pretty primary reason why I'm here.
Right. And the book, Embodied Kabbalah. I guess first off, for people that don't know what Kabbalah is, could you go briefly through its history and just a little bit about it to kind of get people up to speed?
Sure, and to also name the subtitle, which is Jewish Mysticism for All People.
Hmm.
It's meant to open the doors
Oh,
to a relatively obscure and incredibly valuable, but often misunderstood or not understood at all
yeah.
tradition.
Right.
So there's essentially two things that people mean when they say Kabbalah. One of them is just a really broad term for Jewish spirituality. And some people trace that back to the biblical age. Moses, in that sense, practiced Kabbalah in the sense that he was someone who was getting in touch with deeper layers of reality. And that was impacting not just what he perceived, but what he felt and how he acted in the world. That, though it's very difficult to generalize entire traditions, if I had to generalize what does Jewish spirituality mean from since time immemorial, or rather since the first writings,
Yeah.
is it's a combination of perceiving something which lies beyond our basic senses and having that impact us and change the way we're acting in the world towards more kindness, more compassion, more justice. The second way of understanding that term is a more technical definition, is that Kabbalah is a particular style of Jewish spirituality which was first written down in the Middle Ages.
Hmm.
And it's a system which primarily centers itself around 10 divine emanations called Sefirot in Hebrew. People call the structure sometimes the tree of life. It's essentially a ladder or a series of gateways between our world and the infinite.
Mm-hmm.
This system, which it's actually unclear where it really arose from, but certainly didn't exist in writing until around the end of the 1100s. It was so popular and impactful that over the years, it's pretty much every form of Jewish spirituality that's come since then has been influenced by it. And people also tend to look back farther in time and see that maybe that kind of Kabbalah was around in the life of Moses and all
Right.
of that. Now, in my more historical view, I think that's let's call it very interpretive or
Mm-hmm.
a love of myth and all those kinds of things. But I wouldn't say there's any evidence that people in the Bible were using the tree of life and these 10 dimensions of spiritual reality, which the Kabbalists described. And so that is sort of a very brief introduction to that world. And the system which arises from the medieval Kabbalah, people find very helpful for understanding the spiritual journey. And it gives advice and guidance, and there's practices there, but it's also a very powerful categorization tool, a way of understanding the stages of a spiritual journey and the layers of reality in the external world and also in ourselves.
Hmm. Yeah, and so I'm most familiar with the Tree of Life form of the Kabbalah, um, for sure, which has probably influenced lots of the 19th century mysticism and everything that we look at now. Because I can associate a lot of what I've learned in mysticism and spirituality, metaphysics, and I can connect the dots to the Tree of Life, the Sephiroth, and those pathways. Um, so that seems like a very influential portion. And then, of course, you can connect the dots to the more ancient version of the same. Are they both designed for the same intent to kind of build? One is definitely for more awareness, self-knowledge, that sort of thing. Do they both work on a kind of a moral end to try and build a better person?
There's a general, again, general understanding within Judaism that if someone receives powerful visions or ecstatic unitive experiences with the divine and isn't a good person, that they're not really much of a mystic. So at the end of the day, there's not an assessment tool, there's no grades given to
Right.
Jewish mystics, but the idea is someone who reports transcendent experiences but doesn't follow it up with transcendent actions of love and all those
Mm,
kinds of things is there. It's not seen as ideal.
right.
So
It's a
that
waste.
is not as even the waste implies like, oh, send them to the dump and let's start over again, but there's a way in which
Right.
I think everything is repairable. There's lots of potential, but yeah, mysticism is very powerful and can be used for quite the opposite of kindness in the
Right.
wrong hands.
Yeah,
I'll,
exactly.
I'll also say, just to a little bit more history there, that Kabbalah in the like tree of life sense is one of many expressions Jewish spirituality has
Mm,
come in over the ages. So we could talk about prophecy in the Bible, and that's going to be different than 2,000 years ago with the early rabbis who were doing these, what you would call today, astral travel
mm,
through, it's called Merkava mysticism or Hechalot. They're going through chambers in these visionary realms and encountering angels and trying to gaze at the divine throne. And that is
mm-hmm.
distinct from prophecy, which is hearing the voice of God and being a servant or an advocate for God and for justice. And then there's several types that have come through.
Yeah.
So my first definition was just the broad overview of the whole system, and then the second one was a very specific, but it's really, you could categorize at least 5 or 6 different
Mm,
very distinct movements, and even that is getting very general. So
right.
that's one of the reasons I say it's hard to generalize. So I've learned enough history, Jewish history, to say, well, it's complicated. And if I boil it down, and this is really, it's for today, there's other ways
Yeah.
I might have hundreds of years ago described this. And the sort of interesting piece too is you're talking about, or you mentioned the 19th century, let's say esotericism,
Mm-hmm.
occultism, and I'm assuming you're referring to people like Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, Aleister Crowley.
Right.
And so starting in the 1400s in Italy, there was a Christian Kabbalah. there was one person who studied with a rabbi, and he was Catholic, and he wrote this giant book, which included, as part of it, a new form of Christian Kabbalah. And over the years, that changed and developed just like Jewish Kabbalah did. And it was Christian Kabbalah that was primarily what fed into the Theosophical Society in their foundations. And so then they had really a form of Theosophic Kabbalah. And those have all, again, they've intermixed and they've changed over the years. And I think there's actually today quite a blend. And people are tuning into different lineages, actually. There's different forms which arise and emerge. But I, for example, I've read my fair share of Dion Fortune. And there is a way in which my personal journey has also been enhanced by the Theosophic Kabbalah, right? Which is emerging in the 19th century. And it's all a journey, right? For the teachings themselves. And they do change over time. And I think that's beautiful, and something that sometimes people don't realize.
Don't realize, or don't want it to change, or something like that. They want to stay more traditional. But even that tradition is based off of something else that was a tradition based off of something else. It's a very long kind of track.
And as soon as someone, or it's a human tendency to want to grab onto something and say this is how it always is.
Right.
And so in the Jewish world, yes, but also in the Theosophical world. And also in the world of Christian Kabbalah, sometimes people want to talk to me about how Jesus was a Kabbalist. And I have to be careful, because what do you mean by Kabbalist? Do you mean he was using the tree of life in his teachings? Because there's no evidence of that. And as far as we know, that system didn't exist yet. And Madame Blavatsky talked about how the Jews had corrupted Kabbalah, and that it was originally from the Greeks and the Egyptians, which, as far as I can tell, and as far as anyone historically can tell, is a fabrication that she created or something like that because she wanted to claim it for her own. And this is there in human nature. We all have parts of us that want to preserve something and have it as it is. And when there's information that comes across that challenges that, there's a certain part of us and a certain percentage of people, let's say, who want to reject the new information. And so history is both freeing, and it can also be very challenging.
Yeah, definitely. I think that what's really wonderful about now that I find, the internet has allowed a lot of open resource to teachings and practices, and then the research that was done by somebody very obscure that in the 80s you never would have found their information ever. You can look it up and go, oh, somebody researched this and found out that it was completely fake or whatever, or was based off of something completely different with clear lines. Somebody did research and found out more information. So that just there's a cleansing that you can do by delving deeper into a subject with the access that's available now. It's a light being shed on a lot of dark corners in the world of the mystics and esoteric sciences. Even what you're saying is bringing to light a lot of things that without the study, without the history, and without your research, we wouldn't know those things.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword as well, because the internet is also tremendously let's say talented. You can give it a personality maybe in this AI world. It's tremendously talented at also bringing people away from facts.
From truth,
and so it's a mixed blessing, which isn't that kind of perfect, for the world, which there's nothing purely good, purely evil, it seems. Everything's kind of mixed.
Yeah.
And why should the internet be any different? But I will say also, in this information age, every person has access to teachings and techniques, wisdom traditions, books that we just never had before. And so someone coming from let's say a secular perspective to start off with has, this whole world to unfold. But also people who are meeting that world from a religious perspective, there are ways in which they can learn and transform and refine. The question, for example, that Jewish mysticism gets asked just by the world is, what do you have enlightenment? In Jewish mysticism, is there a final stage? And that, by and large, was not a question that was asked a whole lot in the past, because there wasn't much contact with things like Buddhism or Hinduism. And not every mystical system has an end stage or has this sense of a liberation that's final. And so there is a lot of intermixing and there's interspiritual dialogue. And it's a very exciting time. Yeah, as much as any exciting time is also usually a challenging and to some degree scary time.
Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's kind of how we have it today.
Yeah. The internet's a really big tool, like a hammer, and it can be used for all sorts of things, for good, for bad. You could just sit there and not do anything. If you use it in a good way, I feel like research and learning is definitely one of the best parts of it. But there's definitely lots of learning the wrong thing. There's a lot of ways that can go. And my comment really is to Madame Blavatsky, assuming that something was based in a place that it wasn't. And that was probably for a reason that she was doing that. But maybe she didn't know. She didn't have that connection. She didn't understand the linkage, the lineage, and didn't have access to it. That could be. And then she writes and creates and influences a whole new movement based off of, a little bit of truth and a lot of idea.
And I have compassion for people that don't know things. Of course,
Right.
I mean, that's how could one teach if they didn't have compassion for people that weren't aware
Yeah.
yet. And
Right.
I also don't want to let her off the hook entirely, because it's one thing to say this came from the Greeks and Egyptians, but it's another thing to say that the Jewish people corrupted it.
Right.
There
Right.
is,
Exactly.
and we can take certain theological elements out of Western society, but there is also a tinge. People tend to be afraid of, judgmental of the other.
Yeah.
And in Western society, Jewish people have been an other for many years. And that's sort of part of the unfolding. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I can, on some level, I can understand why a person would want to denigrate the Jewish impact on a system that they think is really compelling. But I'm not the appropriation police. I think that appropriation, cultural appropriation, is a term that's massively overused.
Yeah.
And if I have a definition for it that I hold by, it's when someone benefits from another culture's wisdom, technology, medicine, and claims it for themselves, and that original culture doesn't benefit from what they gain. So a big pharmaceutical company that goes into Botswana and gets a very ancient form of medicine that grows naturally there, that a group has cultivated for generations. This is a real story. And then that pharmaceutical company makes billions of dollars off of a diet pill. And meanwhile, that group is becoming increasingly impoverished, and there's no contract, but it was them who discovered it and used it. So it was like ripe for the plucking. So these are the kinds of things that I'm more cautious about. And yes, people aren't always aware, but at some point, there's a sense of what is appropriate here, what is ethical and moral, and everyone makes mistakes also, and we should be forgiving and understanding as reasonable human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're all at different levels, different stages of development in our world and our understanding of cultures. So there has to be a gentle hand, as it were, with that. And I think a lot of appropriation, when they say it's cultural appropriation, that people freak out on a lot, and it should look more like an honor that somebody wants to emulate it. If they're not making a mockery of it, then they're honoring it in a sense by trying to embody it, even if it's not something that was culturally theirs. They're trying to adopt that into their life. But I guess it's the way it's taken, how
it's how it's taken. Yeah. And if
it.
there's specifically if someone's benefiting and really stealing something from another culture, and they don't get anything, they don't get credit, they don't get any, that's where it gets a bit, let's say, more dicey. But in general, cultures benefit greatly, and religions and spiritual traditions benefit greatly from sharing. Yeah. And so there's lots of spiritual teachings from outside of Judaism in my book. It is, I have in the middle of the page is a translated teaching, a mystical teaching from sometime in the last 1,000 years. And then surrounding it is commentary. And some of that explains, because you can translate a lot of mystical teachings into English and they're not going to make any sense still, because it's a symbolic language. There's a lot of key terms and references, and it's hard to express the inexpressible. So partly it's explanatory, but then I want to put it beside sometimes Buddhist teachings or Sufi teachings or Christian mystical teachings and sometimes psychology, because in order for something to be relevant, sometimes it needs to be really placed next to something that people are already familiar with.
Yeah. It's
And
basically
that's,
like a Rosetta Stone translation.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It is an intellectually rigorous book.
Mm.
It is not something that someone could read in a day. It is
Yeah.
ideally, actually, people can read it together. There's a practice of Jewish study in which people actually are reading out loud and they're reflecting on it. It's meant to be a reflection tool, a conversation starter. People can read it
That's
alone,
great. Yeah.
absolutely, but it's very much, it's something to sink your teeth into. And that in many ways, that like the medium is the message, that is Torah study. That is the art of the cultivation of wisdom, the Torah tradition. It is about really sinking in to the text. And these are not simple often. They're not
Right.
I mean, even in English, right? To translate is another is another
Yeah.
layer there.
Right.
But
Right.
part of the
You
idea
could
is to
say
have it
that
be in dialogue. Sorry, go ahead.
it's embodying the Kabbalah.
Yes, right. And so that's
Right.
the other piece.
Yeah.
If to give another definition, so what does embodied mean?
Mm-hmm.
And in the way that I'm using it, I mean a sense of groundedness, a sense of body centered, yes, but also can a person be mystically connected, spiritually transcendent, all of those things, and simultaneously be a normal person?
Mm.
Can they pay their taxes? Can they
Right.
show up on time? Can they be responsible, relatable? That's the fine art. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's can you have a casual conversation while you're waiting in line? And not everyone has to be an extrovert, but the idea is that Judaism is a householder tradition. It is for
Mm.
people with families and or at least dependents. They're people who have jobs that are mystics traditionally, almost across the board. Were
Right.
people with dependents who had responsibilities. They weren't monks. We don't have monks in Judaism. So it is inherently an embodied path. It's something that requires presence and like literally showing up. You might be able to teach a class or lead a meditation, but your spouse probably has a pretty good idea of who you really are.
Yeah.
and
Right.
and all those kinds of things. So it's essentially, can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we be in the world and simultaneously connecting to the profound and the transcendent?
Uh-huh. So it's got a pretty deep meaning just at the title itself. Because my thought it was more like becoming Kabbalah or embodying. And it means that, but it also really means being yourself and moving towards spiritual development. Something
Yeah, it
like
means
that.
it means all of those things. Yeah, in the
Yeah.
same sense that if someone has a blissful moment in prayer, let's say, or meditation,
Mm-hmm.
and they realize that, to quote the Christian Bible, right, that God is love. They realize that God is love in that moment. What
Mm-hmm.
a beautiful thing to realize. What a transcendent, it's peaceful, it's blissful, it's all of those things. The question is, how does that impact them? Like, that's like step two. Yeah,
Right.
process that, be with that,
Embody
like,
it.
what does it mean? Because there is also a tendency, and this is something I stumbled in when I
Mm.
was younger, especially, was, oh, I had this beautiful moment of some kind, and now I want another one, and then I want another one, and I
Right.
wasn't taking time to integrate. And that's actually, not only we don't get to then have that integrate into our lives as
Yeah.
nearly as easily, but it's also, there's actually a risk in that. There is a risky, that it's like playing with fire.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be like playing with psychedelics, and I think psychedelics are another tool, yeah, like a
Yep.
hammer, that
Yep.
can be used for tremendously transformative experiences in the right context, perhaps with a guide or a community.
Yeah.
And they can also lead to a psychic breakdown.
Yeah.
And mystical experiences in general have that capacity, that potential. So it is, that's, in a sense, if we're going to embody Kabbalah, yeah, it's to live it, and it's all the same, right? That's just
Mm-hmm.
what you're saying. To my ear, is just another way of saying what I was saying. But
Right.
it all just comes down to integration, living, and the key part really flows throughout the book is a sense of balance and well-being.
Okay. So, give us an idea then on the book, chapter-wise, the layout.
Hmm.
What are we looking at as far as
So
how do we start into this?
yeah, well, I recommend people read the preface, which is my story about why I wrote the book in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And a brief brief version. I'm happy to go into more
The
detail if you
elevator
have
pitch.
questions. Yeah. No, the
No.
brief version of the preface is I got burned severely
Mm.
by spiritual practice when I was younger, and it took me a long time to figure out what had even happened. And when I finally learned that there's such a thing as too much spirituality,
Yeah.
that can fry someone's system, it took me a long time then to realize that those same teachings, which I had found in this sort of transpersonal psychology world, which is like the psychology of mysticism for anyone listening, that it taught me about what it meant to be grounded and kind of cautious in the path.
Yeah.
And over time, I realized that there was a whole treasure trove of those very, well, they didn't sound the same, but a lot of the meanings were the same within Judaism. And it was Judaism and Jewish mysticism that had burned me in the first place. So
Mm.
I took a while off.
Yeah.
And when I returned and I studied, I realized there was largely well, some of them were untranslated, but many of them were just sort of hidden in all these different books.
Mm.
And so the preface explains my journey of, well, getting burned,
Yeah.
going through a recovery process, going eventually to a Buddhist inspired university for my master's, because that's where I was drawn. But then when I got there, I got this call to be a rabbi. And it was so surprising to me that it took me a number of years to follow it.
Mm-hmm.
And through that process, and when I eventually went to rabbinical school, I discovered this hidden treasure that was right where I'd started in the first place. So that's the preface. There's an introduction that lays out some of these terms I've been explaining already, and explains how the book works, gives some cautions, gives some suggestions, and then the book itself is a collection of 42 individual teachings. 42 is an important Kabbalistic number,
Mm-hmm.
and it's also just the way that the project seemed to unfold and structure itself. I have divided it into sections based on the authors, or rather the teachers who other people recorded. It spans about 1,000 years, going back. The earliest text is, I suppose, around the 1100s, and it goes all the way up to a teacher who died in the year 2000.
Okay.
And so it's texts and teachings based on authorship, commentary that explains, and then there's reflection practices, there's meditations that are suggested, and then in the back there's some appendices, some historical information, and an index to search. There's every single text that's in there also is in Hebrew in the back if there's people who want the original, and they can read Hebrew or Aramaic.
Mm-hmm.
And just a couple other resources in the back, the Tree of Life, those kinds of things, a glossary.
Right, to give people an understanding of what they're reading throughout the book.
Yeah.
Would you say, so it sounds, it's several written works? Maybe it's in a sense, so it could be considered a new form of a more, 1100 AD, but a up to now modern Bible of sorts, a collection of written works and spiritual understandings and practices.
I couldn't personally call it a Bible because of
no.
I can't say that, and I would caution you from saying.
Yeah, I did it,
but just to say, it is a compilation, and it mirrors a traditional Jewish style. That the commentary, there's a central panel. That is how one of our major works, the Talmud, is written. That's the oldest. It's the most significant early rabbinic, like the rabbis of around, let's say it was maybe finished 1,500 years ago, give or take, but it contains many generations of rabbinic teachings and discussions.
Right.
And then there's other discussions that surround it. And so the pages are essentially mimicking that style. And if it's okay, I know there's some of this is audio, but it's also going to be video as well, if I can show.
Oh yeah.
Just on this picture of a single page, just to give a sense of what it looks like.
Oh yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
it looks
Mm-hmm.
like that, as you can see. So in the center of that page, there is the teaching, and then all around it, right, there's different forms of commentary. And if it's a new author, a new section, about the author, I
Right.
give a little bit of historical information. And the inside margin is always explaining, because again, this is it's a symbolic tradition. It's
Right.
it's actually, I would say, impossible for
Hmm.
someone who hasn't learned the system or isn't familiar with the references in the text to decode it without a type of
Key,
commentary.
a key or a commentary. And would you say
Yeah,
that the
exactly.
Talmud was like that as well? Like a surface study is all you're getting if you're not actually reading the side margins to.
And so
Uh,
the Talmud is a whole other kettle of fish, because it is written, the main text is almost shorthand.
mm,
It was an oral tradition before it was written down.
okay.
And so it is it's like, feels like labor sometimes. There's
Yeah.
a joy and a love that emerges, but it's very difficult. And so, and it's in Aramaic and Hebrew, and sometimes there's some Greek words in there.
Mm-hmm.
So for someone who is, let's say, if someone who's trained for a while and can read it without commentary, you might be able to do a few things, but definitely the commentary is in many ways essential,
Essential.
because it's shorthand. There's words missing. There's things that are skipped. It's got kind of a funny syntax. The sentence
Mm-hmm.
structure, the grammar can be strange.
Right.
So my book is far more accessible than the
Yeah.
Talmud,
Yeah.
and that's part of the idea. Again, that people can read a translation of the Zohar, sort of the medieval compendium of Kabbalah,
Mm-hmm.
and without commentary, or even with commentary, it's very challenging. So
Yeah.
my book is, the attempt really was to stay true to the intellectual nature of the tradition and not water it down, if you know what I'm saying, but
Mm-hmm.
also to give access to people who really want to learn this stuff. And
Right.
if people put in effort, I do believe they can crack the code. And
Hmm.
it's not meant to just be theoretical. Sometimes you can read mystical writings and it sounds like they're describing the cosmic realm,
Yeah.
and they are
Right.
sometimes, yeah.
As
And that
above, so
I
below. Right.
right, yes, in general,
Yeah.
if there's a cosmic realm or something really far out, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
not of this world, that's described, I really try to bring it back to something practical and tangible. That's part of that grounded, embodied idea too.
Right. To bring it into a metaphorical understanding.
Or a
To kind
literal
of,
understanding.
or literal. Take the
Yeah, yeah, to take
metaphorical
the
into the
metaphor and
literal.
to
Right.
translate it, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Hmm.
and because, yes, it's, what does it mean that the highest rung is the divine will that is nothingness?
Right.
That
Ein
is,
Sof.
I could just sort of paraphrase the bunch of Kabbalistic teachings right there. Yeah,
Right.
what does that mean? You know, and
Yeah.
so
Wow, that's grand.
yeah, right.
Imagine
Wow. Okay,
that.
so there's
Yeah.
way I could say, well, where does our personal manifestation, our actions in the world begin? Do they begin from simple, are we automatons, or is there a sense of a will within us? Can we
Right.
will things, and how is that connected to the rest of our system? What journey does our will have to take before it comes into action?
Hmm.
and
Yeah. Right.
and there are people who experience something that they can only describe as nothingness or emptiness. And so how is that similar or different to nihilism?
Right.
How can nothingness be beautiful or helpful, or at the very least neutral? And how
Yeah.
can nothingness be defeating and depressing? That basically the same teaching could be simply, oh, that's a description of the world of God.
Yeah.
Or for most of us mere mortals, we can bring it into something a bit more tangible and practical, especially if we are parents or we're working really hard during the day. We might not have time to attain the absolute every day.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the goal, is to kind of I know within some shamanism, which would be really a tribal spiritualism, there is a practice to um, embody that as part of who you are, but not have it be like your job, if that makes sense. So that you are accessible because you're there, you're in and amongst people, but you're accessible for a wisdom, you're
Mm-hmm.
approachable. And you're basically what would be very similar to what you were saying. There isn't a a monk, but that is basically what that role is like a monk that's also there carrying the water, chopping the wood, you know, doing the
I
hard
can't help
labor.
myself. As a dad, I have to make this joke. They're among us.
Yeah.
They're living
Yeah.
within. And so
Exactly. Exactly.
there's one of the teachings, in fact. So again, in a long history, an old tradition, you'll have all types. And there's, as much as I'm saying there's no monks, there's one of my teachers is called, there's an ascetic urge.
Mm-hmm.
There's a way in which humans also, some of them want to deny their bodies.
Yeah.
If you know what I'm saying, that
Yeah.
I
Mm-hmm.
heard someone say one time that outside of a true ascetic religious world, one of the ways that's expressed today could be in running culture. That
Yeah.
there are some people, and look, I think running's amazing. I'm not a particularly great long distance runner, but I respect and almost revere some of those
Mm-hmm.
folks. But there is a way in which a certain denial of physical needs goes
Yeah.
into a lifestyle of a lot of long distance running.
Yep.
And so similarly in the mysticals, I don't even want to call them mystical circles because that sounds like they're just hanging out with each other. But in the older communities, let's say of the 1700s in Eastern Europe, that was a very big. If we're talking about the different types of Jewish spirituality, the 1700s in Eastern Europe was a really important time for Jewish mysticism. It was the beginning of the Hasidic movement.
Mm-hmm.
Today, people think of Hasidic movement as people dressed in a particular way, black coats and maybe big fur hats or big hats and those kinds of things, black hats. And in its origins, people didn't dress like that. And it was actually a radical kind of rebellious popular spirituality
Mm.
of sorts that instead of having to spend decades learning all of the texts so you could finally learn with the Kabbalists, it was, hey, here's a transformative story and here's a little song we can sing and let's
Mm.
dance and let's get ecstatic. And it was a very much popular movement
Oh, yeah.
for common day people. And over the generations, things changed for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
But you have, even in that, and it was that movement for its time was quite, you could call it body centered. That there were teachings say, like, if you enjoy your food deeply enough, you can connect with God, and you can bring blessings into the world simply by delighting in your food.
Right. Right.
And you also have people of those early generations of the Hasidic teachers who are spending all their time in their rooms studying. And there was a particular figure named Abraham the Angel, Avram Amalach in Hebrew, and people would say they could like kind of go see him by the window, and they would look at his face, and his face was so radiant with light that they would get scared. And people asked him to lead a community. It's like, no, I'm too busy with my relationship with the infinite, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so there's contemporaries of his saying things like, well, if you're up on that mountain and you're not going down to intermix with the people,
Right.
that if you're so holy that you've removed yourself beyond all negativity and there's no more sinning for you and there's no more trace of evil within you, well, how are you going to relate to people? Because people contend with everyday urges, and you've, kind of removed yourself from physicality to the degree that, I don't know if this is truly possible, but that's the way they describe it. You're no longer even tempted for anything. You're not even in the realm of sinning. And so basically, how are you going to be of service? And it was very important for those other teachers who had communities, or at least students, cohorts they were training, to say the way forward, the best way, they would argue, is to find that middle ground and be like that shamanic example you're describing.
Mm-hmm.
Even though there's other types out there.
Yeah. Yeah. Then that reminds me of like the hermit, but that hermit would not be shining the light down to those that are on the path below. That hermit would not have a lantern out, just be hanging out in his hovel on the mountaintop.
Yeah, and as much as I'm thus far, emphasizing that kind of embodiment path, the action-based compassion, all of that, there is a part of me that really respects and admires people who seem to be sort of helping the world through consciousness, if you know what I'm saying. And this is the kind of, it's hard to prove that this is what's going on, but I have a sense, you meet a holy person and maybe they spend 9 years in a cave or whatever. There's a way in which there's a certain sanctity there, which I do honor and appreciate, even though it's not my path. And it's, generally speaking, I think there's a very few percentage of people who are really walking that way. And I
Yeah.
I want to encourage and spread really these messages about embodiment, relational mysticism, you could call it, and a certain just every day. Is it possible that I could have a job,
Yeah.
that isn't related to
Right.
mystical pursuits, and also have that as part of my communal life? And then we get into questions of what is it like to have kids, and what is it like to have a family practice
Yeah.
that people could tap into, but it's also not going to be alienating towards the children. There's these are actually for me some of the richest questions. I have an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old, and one of the most helpful paradigms, and there's a page or 2 pages, I suppose, in my book. It's one teaching that spans 2 pages about the Jewish Sabbath, the day of rest, but it's also a day of celebration. And it is, if we can find, I really like regular times in our lives where it's no longer about changing the world. It's not about focusing on anything negative. Actually, it's a celebration of all we have. And in a community, the kids can play while the parents sit around the table with guests and sing songs and eat food. And there's a restfulness of that day. It's actually not even about fixing ourselves anymore. That we're all imperfect vessels, right?
Yeah. Right.
And the idea of spiritual rest as opposed to spiritual work. Spiritual work is about digging deep and what understanding our own entanglements and our constrictions and all of that. But spiritual rest is actually a full-blown acceptance and celebration of who we are. And if we can have that for ourselves and a celebration of the world, and again, our bodies might not feel it, so we eat good food during that time, and we rest. And even traditionally, there's couples are having sex. That is really emphasized in the tradition. That's not ascetic, if you know what I'm saying. That's a very body-based, it's holistic. And so it's interspersing those times, and kids love to hang out with other kids, have some guests over, kids go, they play or they eat the food, but it's like a joyful time for them. And then parents can engage and find that transcendence. And one of my favorite ways is through song.
Okay. And it's very community based. Now, does that form of practice, that's like it's the everyday practice. Does that source back to the ancient times, to, way back? It seems like
which elements that I just described?
Well, the community orientation, to say, the approachability, the everyday use of digging deeper and self-discovery, but also that day of rest, which sounds very
that does go back.
Abrahamic,
Oh yeah,
a day of rest.
The Shabbat, the Sabbath is, we actually, there's not much specific
Saturday,
information
right?
given back. Yeah, it's a Saturday, but it's the what I just described. There's, again, like the spirituality changes over the years, so do the practices and the rituals. So Shabbat is found, it's the first chapter of the whole Hebrew Bible, right? In the beginning, and then there's the 6th day and the 7th day God rests. So it goes back a fair amount of time. I don't know, it's hard to say when exactly it first emerged, but in a temple-based culture back thousands of years ago, the Israelite temple and the Judean temple, it was also a day of literally bringing offerings, special offerings on the Sabbath. And there was a way in which we don't do that anymore, but we have special prayers traditionally. But the idea, the communal element, and it took me a while to realize and appreciate this part of it, because I'm very much, as much as I'm a rabbi and I teach religion, I feel like quite a secular spiritual practitioner in many ways. That my basis from which I approach the world is not filtered through the Bible or through Jewish teachings. It's filtered through my values, these modern values, Western values that I grew up on. And so that's a very individualistic culture. And that's a very individual path. And so I was really attracted to things like Buddhism or certain expressions of New Age that had to do with personal enlightenment. And I just saw that as spirituality itself. And the way I came to understand it, again, that's a question that maybe Judaism hasn't been asked as much over the generations, is, well, how individualistic is this path? That's the kind of thing that it might have had to encounter modern Western psychology and Eastern religions to some degree.
Yeah.
to answer. So the answer that I've come to is that, in one of the terms that's used for different Buddhist lineages, they're vehicles. So
Hmm.
there's the diamond vehicle, yeah, and there's the greater vehicle, the lesser vehicle. I don't know if
Right.
people who are Theravadan like to be called the lesser vehicle so much, but just to say they're vehicles. And if I think about a vehicle, I think about a car or a motorcycle, maybe a bike.
Mm-hmm.
But in that sense, Judaism is a caravan. It
Hmm.
is a whole group of people, and the only way to travel Judaism, and it's not an individual. Yeah, you can do. There's lots of things in the book, for example, that someone could just utilize on their own, but the true expression of so much of this is as a community, and that is also in our era both deeply needed because there's so much loneliness out there,
Yeah.
in our cities, and it's deeply needed, but it's a challenge. And so as I'm going, since writing my book, and for many years I've thought of what would it look like to offer Shabbat,
Hmm.
that practice of Sabbath, to a non-Jewish, setting, and to the world more broadly. And what it comes down to is it's possible to do. I've sort of innovated with, my wife, this sort of practice we call oasis time,
Hmm.
and it's like Shabbat, but it's more universal. It's less sort of Hebrew, for example, and it's
Yeah.
more practical. And it can be done any day of the week, and not just a Saturday. It can be done on a Sunday, and those kinds of things. That what that requires then is a collective who are practicing. And so in where I live in Victoria, British Columbia,
Hmm.
I don't know how it's all going to unfold, but I've got sort of receiving some inner and outer murmurings around what would it look like to have a wider circle of oasis time practitioners in a neighborhood, a community, even a whole city.
Hmm.
It's a challenge, if you know what I'm saying. It's easier to get an app, and
Yeah.
meditate. And that
Yeah.
like that's like what a wonderful thing. Buddhism has,
Right.
like, wow, the fact that mindfulness is everywhere right now, what a success.
Yeah.
And
Right.
there's another stage here. I feel like a community, if it's possible, they have that in Buddhism too. It's called a sangha. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Right.
it is really seen as a wonderfully helpful spiritual technology, a community.
Yeah.
And so what does that look like? How do those form, and how can I help bring that into the world some more?
Yeah. It's the idea with an oasis that you get there when you get there, and you bring what you have with you, and then you celebrate the fact that there's water in the desert, that sort of thing. It's not
Yeah,
so
that
it's not so beholden to a specific. This is the way it's done. It's whatever you got with you. That's how we do it.
yeah, and yes, it's not, someone doesn't have to, let's say, adopt a religion to
Right.
to
Right.
practice it.
Conform to the
And
oasis.
and
Yeah.
and that in a lot of ways our world can sometimes feel like we're in a wilderness, and that it's work to go through the desert.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a way of punctuating that desert work
I like
with
that. Yeah.
with good times and good feelings and good friends, yeah, and good company. That's Someone asked me recently. I was doing an interview with actually a Theosophical Society,
Hmm.
and someone said, "Well, hold on a second, Rabbi, or maybe call me Matthew. That I don't always get along with my family. So what am I supposed to do there?" And I said, if you're looking for oasis time, it's really should be with people you love being around, right? And he,
Yeah.
he was older. I don't think he had like little kids living with him at home or whatever, but he's saying that
Right.
people don't always get along with their relatives. It doesn't have to be relatives, right? That there's ways in which, as parents, the kids in the home, there's like, how can we create something where the most number of people benefit? And I think it's great
Yeah.
to also hire childcare for part
Right.
of that too. Can we give ourselves a rest? And
Right. Right. Because that's
that
part of the raising of kids. That's also a job. That's
that
a
can
lot
be
of work.
work. It
Yeah.
often is, yeah. And especially the nuclear family is sort
Yeah.
of the last hope,
Yeah.
right? But a lot of our ancestors, broadly speaking, were not nuclear families. Yeah, it's
Right.
a relatively kind of strange unit, and is only possible because of the degree of societal wealth and access to resources we have. We
Yeah.
actually, part of what created these larger structures was a need to rely on each other. And I know there's a lot of people who don't experience wealth every day, and I don't mean this as sort of like a forgetting of their situation. I guess what I'm saying is the average home, the fact that we have our own little structures and that we can turn on the faucet and get an automatic hot springs waterfall we call a
Right.
shower
Yeah.
every day. Like those, like they're, modern medicine, food, relative food security in the West. Yeah.
Hmm.
Not to denigrate anyone who's not experiencing these things, but those things are they're also a mixed blessing because they've caused us to be more separate from one another
Yeah.
because our sense of reliance isn't as imminent.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's a step above the ground that we're you know on, basically. So it's a separation, um, fabrication, and it's not really reality. It is reality, but it's a composed reality that isn't very real when you go anywhere else in the world. If you landed on an island and oasis of
Yeah.
that sort, you're like, hey, here we are. Okay, where's the running water? You know.
So that's what for I think for myself and I think for a lot of people during COVID, there was this sense of
Hmm.
at the beginning, I remember those first few weeks
Yeah.
and it was this great unknowns. And it was this feeling like everything, this sense of security that I had had for the first 34 years of my life
All right.
are to some degree were an illusion. It was there, but it was always able to be taken away. I just never experienced that level of unsurety
Yeah.
and the possible what was going to happen to our world and all of that. There is an illusion we sort of carry around with all of it.
Oh yeah.
The Just to go back a moment about sort of the flexibility of Oasis time. So my experience teaching things like this so far, and I've been doing it for a few years now, is that most people I have taught, and I've taught some spiritual teachers, right? These are people who have lots of experience. They're yoga instructors, they're what have you, counselors. Most people want to learn a system
Yeah.
that most people don't want to innovate until they've adopted and ingested. And that was actually surprising to me when I first started teaching
Mm.
because I really wanted everyone to make it their own. And they were like, no, no, no,
Uh,
no. How do we do this? And so what I've offered and what I offer more and more, and this is sort of like a trajectory for me. It's new in the amount that I'm emphasizing, and I'm feeling very called to this
yeah.
work of a broader Oasis
Mm.
teaching is that there's methodology. There's a what a lot of people, and I didn't realize until I really started practicing Shabbat or getting relating to it when I was a teenager and even older than that, is that to really do it, it takes some preparation. That actually, if I want to give myself a wonderful day off and I'm not flying to Club Med somewhere, the way
Hmm.
I do that is I pre-cook my food.
Yeah.
And I'm not like there's nothing forbidden for me. Like there's some traditional Jewish practitioners who don't want to cook food, and that's they see that as a prohibition from the
Right.
tradition. Fine, I don't see it as a prohibition, but I can tell you, the more I cook, the worse I feel personally. And so I have crock pots, or I even sometimes pre-make pancakes that I can just heat up in the microwave, and there is something delightful. It feels like I'm
Yeah.
being served,
Right.
and
Right.
so or a clean house
Yeah.
as much as we can, right? There's everyone's got their own degree of that, but for me, I feel so much more mentally well when
Yeah.
I have a clean house. So I usually, when I do it with my family, my wife will take the kids out for a few hours. They'll go hang out with people. They'll go wherever they're going on some adventure or grocery shopping, who knows? And I'll clean the house, if it's not clean, and I'll do a lot of cooking, and then we can kind of settle in.
Hmm.
And that's part of that process. And in the same way, it would be very hard to invent mindfulness meditation for oneself that we draw on, right? As much as there's
Right.
science around it and all that, it comes from largely a Buddhist lineage.
Right. Right.
Similarly, if people want to do Oasis time, I recommend that they engage with Jewish wisdom teachers because this is really a cultivated, thought out method, and I've adapted it and universalized it, if you will, but it's not something. It's hard actually to just
Mm.
create from scratch. And
Yeah.
if I hadn't encountered all of these teachings and these practices, I'd be quite lost in it myself too.
Yeah. And I think you touched on that. I had something very similar when I was beginning my path of discovery. I was getting an overflow. My cup was flowing over with all these different ideas, and there wasn't somebody for me to go. So where do I go to next? What's the first step? How should I approach this? What should I start to do? Um, and it became very overwhelming, and I definitely had to work my way out of what I dug myself into just by just by reading, just by trying to absorb different sources and access different latent talents in myself, but not
Mm.
doing it with proper guidance or walking up the ladder rung by rung. And so that idea seems really important, and something that I definitely try to push on this show is that, especially because I'm interviewing people that do this kind of work, is to say if you have any kind of stumbling block, ask for help. Find
Oh,
somebody that's
absolutely.
going to has been there, done that, and has an idea as to the proper protocol. Because there's no reason not to. you know.
Definitely. And just, if there's people listening right now saying, I wish I had a guide or I wish I had a mentor, just to let people know, I work one-on-one with
Yeah.
students and of any background. And my approach is it's very student centered. Like, where are you at? Like, what are your questions? And let's find ways to help you with what you're working through, and take you to the next phase of your own development. That at the end of the day, I think a spiritual guide should be a servant of people's higher selves,
Right.
and
Right.
helping a person become who they are more fully. So I do that, partly with teachings from Kabbalah, like we've been talking about, but also I do a lot of body centered introspective guidance, sort of a somatic. We haven't really
Mm.
talked as much about that yet, but there's a way in
Mm-hmm.
which the body itself can be this tremendously helpful tool
Yeah.
for understanding our inner world. That anyone who knows the experience of having a knot in their stomach or a tightness in their chest or even an expansive feeling in their chest, that's actually an invitation to
Yeah.
self-knowledge. And if we learn how to speak the language of the body, there's a lot that it wants to tell us. It turns
Right.
out.
Yeah, I sometimes when I'm talking about it to someone, it's like we're in a soup, and there you make it's not like a pool because it's too big, but we're in a soup, and if you move part of it, it actually pushes into you, and you can feel it, but you may not be aware of it. That sense might not be developed, so you may not know that there's this movement towards you that's happening. That
Yeah,
sense can be developed. All those
absolutely.
senses can be developed. It's just that
Yeah,
we don't out of necessity use them. So that's not a lion
it's
attacking us. You know what I mean? So we're not like,
it's
oh,
also, yeah, what you like, just a general sort of our cultural, let's say, resting place where our
right,
averages culturally does not, it
doesn't
doesn't
need it.
promote that kind of introspection. But fortunately, this is not something I take lightly. We live in an era of tremendous religious freedom,
Yeah,
and that's partly why we can have this conversation. It's one of the reasons why I can say openly as a rabbi that I have learned from many different non-Jewish traditions.
right.
Because in the past, some of these teachers in the book here were people who obviously, for any sort of keen eye, they obviously had interactions or influences from outside of
Mm,
Judaism. It's like,
mm.
where did these ideas come from, if not these other books or these other practitioners? But they couldn't say it.
Right.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
because of the era. And it was an intercommunal thing, but it was also the world at large. It was a very segregated,
Yeah.
risky kind of endeavor. And so there is a deep gratitude that I have. And it is, there's always something wrong in the world, yeah. And I think social media right now has reminded us ad nauseum all those things. And yeah, there's some things that definitely need working on. Don't get me
Right.
wrong,
Right.
in a big way. And I think there's also a lot of gratitude I feel for this era and the generation we're in, and we're living the dreams of our ancestors on so
Yeah.
many levels.
Yes, no doubt. Now, I feel like, and I know sometimes I talk to people and they have no reference point at all with the Kabbalah. They have no idea, don't know it exists, or I'm not really sure. But to me, it felt like it was very exposed, very easy to tap into and find information about it. And like I said, it was actually I think it was the Zohar that I was
Hmm.
initially working with. That was very. It was like I felt like I was reading really old world understandings of a lot. It felt very dark and very light at the same time. It was a very interesting mixture, but it was also in a book that I picked up somewhere and was able to read about. It seemed very
Mm-hmm.
accessible to me and very wide open, whereas a lot of these traditions were initially verbal and then only written down to those that could, would or wanted to or could study and read and write and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So it became very hidden, you know, esoteric, as it were, maybe on purpose, or maybe it was just, maybe that's
Oh,
my
some of it was
understanding of it.
definitely on purpose.
Yeah. But I feel like, and what you're doing is also very, so my thought is that it was very accessible, but also didn't have any guidance. There wasn't really a lot of like, well, who do I talk to about this kind of
Mm-hmm.
information? What you're doing, is it very similar to that, where you're saying like, look, here's, here it is, here's the info, and with some practical steps to kind of, embody the work, to try and live that work.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Yes, and I teach classes on this, right?
yeah,
Literally right now. I'm not sure when this is airing, but we're here at the beginning of May. We're speaking, and I'm actively right now teaching a class
yeah,
on embodied Kabbalah, and it's in eight sessions, and we're going through particular teachings, ranging from personal spiritual freedom to ways of kind of getting out of anxiety so that we can kind of go a
mm,
little bit deeper. And one of my favorites, it's telling a joke. It's a story of a teacher who says we should tell a joke at the beginning of the class so people can relax, so
yeah,
we can go deeper with the material. And then, body-centered spirituality. And we're going to go into some of the, what are the risks involved in mysticism and how do we stay grounded and on all those kinds of things. So yes, it is both very much an accessible book, but I'm also available as a teacher or a speaker. I do, scholar in residence type things.
mm,
I'm developing corporate workshop right
mm,
now. And the idea is it's all of those things. I want to be a teacher for people. And yes, I'm an author, but I'm very much, an extrovert, as you could
yeah,
probably tell. And
yeah,
I really love interacting and being an in-person or an online teacher. And so these are all ways in which I'm wanting to help. And if it's all right, I want to share a teaching that, if something actually you mentioned a few minutes ago, this experience of overwhelm, you
mm,
said. And
mm-hmm,
it's well, on some level, I need to be people say, oh, I have all these different kids and they're all my favorite, so maybe all of the texts are my favorite, but when I talk about one, it feels like my most favorite in the moment. So
yeah,
this is my most favorite right now. Is it's and this isn't it's a really, it gives a clear example of how the mystical tradition uses symbols. So this is a
yeah,
teaching that, if I were to sum up in one sentence, is that we should take a pause after a very expansive moment or experience so that we can take time to integrate before we're ready to move to the next level.
right,
That's the teaching. But this teaching, it does not say that. It
mm,
says, I mean, it doesn't say that so directly. This is
mm,
sort of the beauty of the, like, it's art in a way. Like, it's
yeah,
the art of how can you communicate something of value, but using a traditional source. That's sort of also the way that it allows the teaching to be carried on through the generations.
mm,
Because it's not just a simple phrase anymore. Now it's, oh, this is Torah. This is the
right,
wisdom tradition. This is so essentially Moses and the burning bush. For people who aren't familiar with that story, Moses is with his sheep. He's now, according to the Torah, I think around 80 years old, which is often forgotten. He's quite old.
mm-hmm,
But the people of Israel are enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt, and Moses had kind of escaped. He's with his sheep and he's wandering with them, and he sees this sight, this burning bush. And so there's a particular interpretation of this from one of these early Kabbalists. And he says, when Moses first saw the burning bush, right? The traditional story is he goes and he turns aside and looks at it, and God speaks to him from the burning bush, and he becomes a prophet. And he goes, that's the
yeah,
beginning of his journey to rescue the Israelites. But
right,
this mystic says, he didn't think it was the burning bush. He didn't think it was anything divine. He just thought it was a strange sight.
mm,
And this, in fact, it says that if Moses had thought this was God appearing, he would have walked the other way because it
right,
would have been frightening. And
yeah,
so, in a sense, it's like God was sort of being accessible and being friendly. But you can also say it's like God was flirting with
Yeah.
Moses and he didn't come on too strong.
Not too
If
strong.
it's
A
a
burning
first
bush.
date,
No.
yeah, if it's a first date and
Yeah.
we bear all, right, that can actually
Right.
prevent a connection. And so that's kind of what God is doing in that moment. And by the way, I say this in the introduction of my book, I'm using the term God, but it's really whatever serves a person is fine. You could say reality. You could say this is just a myth and a legend and some
Yeah.
story. It doesn't matter to me. The point is there's a lesson here, and it's the practical. I think theology, our view of the divine or whatever, should serve us
Mm-hmm.
in our action, and that's the real measure here. So if you don't like the word God, we'll say spirit,
Or
creator,
whatever. Right.
whatever. So deep reality is one of my
It's a
favorites too.
it's a placeholder, and it's
It's a
supposed to be.
placeholder, yeah, but
If
sometimes the
it's all and
placeholder,
nothing, then it really is
sometimes,
anything you
yeah,
want it to be. You know?
sometimes the placeholder can come on too strong, right?
Yeah.
The G
Right.
word, God
Definitely.
can be pretty. There's a lot of baggage with that word. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, so spirit knows that Moses isn't quite ready for that moment. So Moses sees this strange sight. There's a fire and the bush is not being consumed. How often do we see that? Something's burning, but it's not burning up. It's just sort of staying there,
Right.
which also, by the way, that's a great spiritual metaphor. Can we tap into the fire without being consumed?
Mm. Mm.
So Moses approaches, and then it says there's an angel which speaks out of the fire, and that's interpretive. This is sort of the commentator kind of mixing up the order of things a little bit,
Mm.
but it says Moses then hears the voice of the angel, and then it says his mind or his consciousness is strengthened. And that's the literal translation. It's not his consciousness is
Mm.
expanded. It's his consciousness is strengthened because guess what? It's possible to have a weak consciousness or a weak
Right.
mind and actually not be able to handle something. And so it says that he sort of leveled up, but he paused. There was this sense of integration. And then,
Mm.
only then could he hear the divine presence, the spirit speaking to him. And again, his mind is consciousness is strengthened. And the teaching ends by saying, well, if someone is living in a dark cave and then they go out into the light of day and they might get blinded, their eyes will
Mm-hmm.
darken because of that. But if they go slowly, they'll be able to eventually see the light of day. Isn't it the case that our souls, our minds, our inner worlds work the same as our bodies?
Right.
That why should we think that our soul is ready for the most transcendent experience ever? Like why would we think that? Doesn't it follow the same rules as our body? I'm not going to walk in to a gym and lift the 500-pound weight on my first day because that's going to
Yeah.
injure me. But if I get the 10-pound weight and I let my muscles rest and restore and strengthen,
Mm-hmm.
then the next time I can lift the 12-pound weights or that kind of thing. And it's that's how the inner world works as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. That's great. Yeah. Very good insight into that. And would it be possible that strengthening of the consciousness is also an alert to firm up to so if you're just wandering around tending to the sheep and just doing the thing, you're drifting in mind, you're not really doing much up here. You're not doing much with your mind. You're not doing much with your consciousness. You're just doing the mundane. But then you see an anomaly that, like you said, it could have been frightening if it was perceived to be something of a high holy, right? Too much.
Yeah.
It could be perceived as nothing. Oh, why is that bush burning? And just you keep going and just missed it. You missed it. Or it could be that spark, that light that catches you when you're not looking, and then all of a sudden you're like, hey, wait a minute. That bush is still there. It's still burning. It's still there. I need to level up. I need to get with it. Something's happening.
In fact,
something magical.
I love that you're sharing that. There's a what's called a midrash. It's like a rabbinic teaching that isn't in the literal text, but it's sort of on some level. One form of midrash is like fan fiction. Yeah, where the early rabbis are saying, well, so there's a story about Abraham, and why was he the one who's chosen by the divine to be this messenger and this father or grandfather really of this whole lineage? Like, why Abraham? that
Right.
he becomes this, like, he is, I mean, the term really is patriarch. That term doesn't sound quite as neutral as it used to.
Yeah.
The
Right.
patriarchs, yeah, but the
Yeah.
ancestors. He is the kind of lineage holder, the lineage starter, the seed of that whole, all the Abrahamic faiths. But in
Yeah.
Judaism, we trace ourselves back. So why Abraham? So the midrash, the fan fiction, the early rabbis tell is that Abraham was like someone who was walking by on a path, and there was a burning house
Mm.
that was next to that path, and people had been passing by that burning house for years,
Mm.
and nobody seemed to notice. And Abraham looked over and said, "Whoa, there's a house on fire." Yeah,
Mm.
and that's sort of the metaphor for the world is on fire. There's something broken, or there's something misaligned, and some people notice it and some people don't. And
Right.
sometimes the same person a few years apart will notice it, right? When they wouldn't have before. I really think everyone
Yeah.
has the potential to have that Abraham moment, that
Mm.
just
Mhm.
that, even when God says to Abraham, go forth from your home. And it's like, I can't remember the whole exact verse, but it's something like from your father's home and from
Yeah.
your land. And one of the interpretations I love is that there is a moment where we can realize who we were raised to be and how
Mm.
our, let's say, multi-generational trauma perhaps informed how we should be.
Yeah.
And when we actually can have that moment of self-awareness, I mean, that's that Abraham moment. That's the beginning of a journey right there.
Right. And it's also taking a leap, because that message is saying go,
Mm-hmm.
and it's much like, and you see that throughout the old stories, is that somebody's doing something that doesn't make sense to culture, doesn't make sense to the society that they're in. Noah with the flood, like, build this thing. It's like, what? Everybody else like, what are you doing? What's going on? Are you
The end of
crazy?
that verse with Abraham is, go to a land that I will show you.
Yeah, like,
Yeah.
good luck.
It's like, trust me, you're gonna
Yeah.
see the land eventually. And that's when we get into this concept, which again has many meanings in English, this concept of faith.
Yeah.
So yeah, so again, you study enough of anything, you realize there's so many ways of understanding it and interpreting it. But the general theme, or at least the one that I think is quite broadly what's meant in Judaism when we say the word faith in Hebrew, emunah, it's
Mm.
not a belief in God's existence, but it would be as though you said to someone, "I believe in you." You
Mm-hmm.
don't mean that you're asserting that they are real. You mean
Right.
you trust in them. You
Right.
believe that. And so faith in that sense is when we don't know where we're going, it's a trust that we're walking down the right path and that
Mm.
what we need will be revealed to us at the right time.
Yeah, that's great. And that is the faith that you need to have when you're walking along that desert
Yeah.
road.
Yeah,
There will be food at the
absolutely.
end of this trail, right?
Hmm.
Whatever you
Yeah.
need will be provided.
So
Um,
I'm in the summertime, I'm doing something called Welcome Home. It's a course, an online course that ends in an in-person retreat on
mm,
Vancouver Island. People
oh,
are from all around are invited, but it's this idea of what does it mean to come home,
mm,
to come home to our bodies, or to come home to a tradition. Or there's a sense, I think it was Macklemore I've seen on her, and I don't know when the interview's from, but it's come up on my feed a lot,
yeah.
where someone is challenging him and saying, well, what do you say to people who say that you're a guest in hip hop, right? Macklemore's
Mm,
white.
mm-hmm,
He's in this rap world, and he says that's true. Great response. Very humble. I'm just, from what I've seen, very impressed by he seems like a wise person.
yeah.
And he says, I am a guest, and I'm very happy to have been invited here, but I know I'm a guest. Yeah. And so it's like almost, Macklemore, where's home? And some people, they want to be guests, and everyone benefits from hosting. I think, good guests,
Right.
it's like really enriches a household, but what does it mean to come home? So there's one of my favorite Hasidic stories has the theme of home, but also the theme of trust in
Mm,
it. And with your permission, I'd like to just share it.
please.
It's
Yeah.
a short story. So
Mm-hmm,
there's this peddler who lives in Prague. This is a long time ago, hundreds of years ago. And he's selling, his wares, pots and pans during the day. And he doesn't have a lot of money. His shoes are kind of worn out. And he lives in this old rickety home, this kind of stone wall. And the door is, very on its hinges. And it's just, he's not a wealthy man. And one night he goes to bed and he he just says, dear God, if I could have just a little bit of money for my, for my later years, I'm not always going to be able to walk all day. And that night he has a dream. And in this dream, he sees the city of Vienna, and there's this palace. And next to this palace, there's a bridge. And underneath the bridge, he sees this pot of gold, this beautiful, shining pot of gold. And it's one of those dreams where it's just so aware this is in his dream. It's an important dream. This is something happening here. And he wakes up and he says, wow, never had a dream like that before. But, okay, dreams come and they go. So he goes about his day, and he has another day of peddling his wares, makes a few, whatever the currency was in Prague in the 1700s. And he goes to bed a second night. And that second night, he has the exact same dream. A palace in Vienna, a bridge, a pot of gold, and it's really vivid. And he wakes up and says, all right, my grandmother told me to wait for 3 signs. Okay, 2 nights in a row. That's amazing. But come on, I'm practicing grounded spirituality here. I can't just go off on a whim to Vienna. And so as it happens, the third night, he has the exact same dream. Palace, bridge, pot of gold, Vienna. He wakes up, he says, that's it, I'm going to Vienna. And he gets on his backpack and he walks, because he's a walker. And it's 3 days away. He arrives and he's walking through Vienna and he sees this palace. He's never been there before, but he just, wow, like here we are. And he gets there and he sees the bridge. And of course there's a gate because it's a palace. And he's standing on the edge and he's looking, where is this pot of gold? And a guard comes up to him. And this guard says, can I help you? And this peddler was honest. And he said, this sounds kind of crazy, but I had these dreams. And in my dream, it was this palace and there was a bridge and a pot of gold, and the guard starts laughing at him. And he said, oh, you fool. Who follows their dreams? Come on. I mean, if I was following my dreams, I'd be walking to Prague right now. I mean, just last night, I had this dream that under the kitchen, buried in this old rickety stone wall, doors hanging on its hinges, home in Prague, that there was a pot of gold underneath the kitchen. Can you believe it? And the peddler says, thank you, sir. And puts his backpack back on and runs back to Prague. It only takes him 2 days this time. And he gets there and he goes back inside his own home where he had started from in the first place. And he gets out a shovel and he starts digging into the tiles of his floor. And lo and behold, underneath the kitchen, right where he had started from, his own home, he finds this pot of gold.
Yeah, that's great. All those dreams, and when you get where you think you're supposed to be, keep listening.
Yeah, and we never know where it's guiding us, and sometimes we really have to leave home in order to find it. We actually have to go out, and there's something that we need out there that isn't at home. And maybe it's really, we're going to be guided back to rediscovering the treasure that we had right under our feet the whole time. But the only way to find it is to go out there and to trust in that process.
Yeah, that's great. Good lesson, definitely. And then that process of coming home, of course, he can find himself in contentment. He got what he wanted. He had to go on a journey, but he got his wish, or his prayer was answered. Yeah, with little effort.
Absolutely right. It does take a little effort. This world is we have to work sometimes. To get there. And I think a lot about, I remember, so I went to a Buddhist university, Naropa in Colorado, and I heard a lot of stories about, the Dalai Lama who meets people, and at some point, I think relatively early on in his sort of really public teaching career, saying, you should probably go back to your own tradition. Yeah, like you've gained things here, but I don't want to make you a Buddhist. Maybe you should go and you should find this in Christianity. And in many ways, that's what I had to do. I left my tradition for some number of years, and I explored and benefited from all these other systems. And then there was this real sense of homecoming and of finding the treasure that was waiting, that I actually couldn't access yet because I didn't have the resources and the translation skills and all of that. But I think there's a human need that we all have on some level to connect with our ancestry.
Right. And to feel grounded in that.
Yeah, there's something there for us. Even, and I think about all the ways in which people get separated from their ancestry, all the good reasons, mind you, and all the abuse that can happen, or all of just the really like misguided teaching or money asking or manipulation and power dynamic. Yes, that's all of that can happen. And I sort of I hope for people that they can find, connections with where their ancestors came from, and partly we can be inspired from other paths, but there's a way in which there's a coming home. I think people have a capacity to experience in a lineage that their ancestors shared, because there's a genetic component to spiritual orientations.
Right. It's, electrical. It's in the DNA, and it's, something that can be really harnessed, grasping onto those traditions. I think it's very, very powerful. But in the same sense, now with this book that you've written, this is a departure from traditional, or is it, would you say it's adjoining to the traditional methods and means of study?
I would say that Judaism is both a tradition and an innovation, or a series of innovations. And if it's a spectrum, yeah, I'm on the sort of innovative wing. And there is something that's happened with some of the biggest innovators in Jewish tradition, is that they've had their books burned by other Jewish, and that on some, I'm not asking for that, but like there is ways in which the traditionalists are going to reject things and the innovators are going to embrace it. But some of them, my heroes in my own tradition and history, have been very controversial in their era and then have become mainstream in the coming generations. And I'm very inspired by that. And I feel like on some level, I'm in the universality, especially, or the way that there's a lot of this body-centered spirituality that's kind of more in the psychological realm or in the meditative realm, that's not explicitly in the Kabbalistic. Some of the practices, it's a syncretism, it's a new creation. And that's an innovation. It's a revolution, it's all those kinds of things. And I see that also very much as though as an expression of the Jewish creativity, which I have found in my own lineage as I've looked back, that one of the great successes of the way that people interpret the Bible and interpret the other teachings is that sometimes it can make it sound like it's always been this way, but that's almost a cleverness and a hiding of it, right? Like the Zohar makes it sound like Kabbalah has been around since time immemorial, but as far as we know, the Zohar was a huge innovation. It just couched its teachings within this traditional language, and so in some way, I feel aligned in that lineage of innovators. While also saying, at the end of the day, I think Judaism always has had universal goals, and so sharing this more widely is part of that as well. And I'll also just share that when I started in this very explicitly universal teaching, anyone is welcome. It's Jewish mysticism, it's Kabbalah for all people, any background. It was surprising on some level to me that a lot of the people who were really most eager to learn from me, especially one-on-one, were people who had some kind of Jewish ancestry and had felt left out or alienated in some way. And they were looking for a way back in, and they didn't feel like they could connect with a community as a whole, perhaps, but they saw me as an individual. And so it started with these were very spiritually awake and developed people. It was phenomenal to meet them. And then we started learning Kabbalah, and some of them quite quickly were, what would it look like to go to synagogue? Or what would it look like? There was a way in which they were trying to connect with their own ancestry, and that the universal open wide tent was very inviting. And so it's been fascinating to see the way that accidentally, I found this great group of people.
That's excellent. And it's accessible. Is that, so, and kind of what I was leaning into was that seems like there was a closed off, like a closed door when you're trying to access these mysteries. And though it's accessible, it's been exposed for a very long time. You can access books with this information and et cetera, but it seems like it is on purpose supposed to be closed off. Is what you're doing kind of an opening so that it is giving some secrets of what would be considered secrets to the greater world?
In a sense, but I'm sort of if my goal was to reveal secrets, I'm a few decades too late. if you know what I'm saying, that there's been people who have been doing that since before I was born in English. And in some ways, I have permission to do what I'm doing just because of what's preceded me. And there's a certain historical academic, let's say, perspective that I'm bringing, that since people are already reading this stuff, they should probably get access to some of the history, which is often, I'm going to put this very nicely, mistold or misunderstood in some of those other writings. And also, this is it's an empowerment project. My goal as a teacher is to help people be more themselves. And I don't want to create a reliance structure in which people are reliant on me or on a particular book for all of their spirituality. And so I see that in the world, there is unfortunately no shortage of Kabbalah being taught. That's very much, it's a more, let's say, in the best sense, magical, in the worst sense, superstitious, and kind of, do this and your problems will be solved. And there is a whole genre of that in the New Age world, and God bless them. I hope they really help people, and I see how it's profitable. The other kind of profit, and they're bringing a certain genre of the old world in a way that I don't think is particularly helpful. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. But just to say, it's also that there's a sense of obligation to share something that is directly more empowering and also historically based, because it's already out there. And so, it's accessible, but it's also a vantage point that I'm hoping has a lot of integrity. That's a big goal here too. And to say, at the end of the day, someone can read all they want, but if they haven't had a personal experience around it, they're not going to get the secret. The secret is the experience. And so it's actually impossible to relay this. Now, there's a lot of reasons why our ancestors, broadly across traditions, were careful with revealing things. And one of them was a fear of people going too far with them, right? Like injuring themselves psychically in ways that we've described. And so I really try with this book it's grounded, it's supposed to excite, but also really promote integration. And the other thing people were worried of is people using these kinds of symbols and metaphors for power and power over others. And like at the end of the day, it's the information age. There's no shortage of people who are going to try to take advantage. And that's just sort of another human impulse, sadly. But I'm hoping that if other people can read this stuff, and you don't have to kind of buy into something just because someone says, "Oh, here's the magic of Kabbalah," right? Well, I read in this other book that it's actually like this. Like maybe there can be a counterbalance there. But at the end of the day, it's about empowerment, and is the big impulse why I wanted to share.
Now, what would you see as the dividing line between power and empowerment?
Oh, that's interesting. So when that's a good term to kind of get into definitionally. And I should also say I need to empower myself to eat dinner very soon, and so I need to leave this very juicy conversation. But I'll say this, and I'm happy to kind of sum up together. But the piece the way I differentiate when I talk about power dynamics, I mean one person having power over another. And so in that, if I was more of a guru, or to use a traditional Hasidic term, a Rebbe versus, let's say, a teacher or a rabbi, I would have followers, people following me and relying on me for their insights and, feeling spiritual when they're in the right presence. And that would be the way I conducted myself. That's not, that's power dynamics, right? Or even just people who use, let's say, ideas to control populations. I mean, there's no shortage of that in religious history.
Right.
And so empowerment is, you have a power within you, and you might have not found it quite yet, or you might have found it and it overpowered you for a moment. So my job as a teacher is to not create a dynamic in which you need me for your spirituality, but in which you can really learn how to find and trust your inner voice. That's empowerment. It's that you have a teacher within you, and my role, ideally, right, my goal as a teacher is to help you find that and be able to communicate with it. Because it actually, in this sort of strange twist, this maybe irony of this whole, most people can't find that on their own. Most people need guidance. And so, I am successful if you are, you know who you are, and you can follow that and go find other teachers and go, inspire others. That's the empowerment piece. And that's in many ways the opposite of that kind of teacher-student discipleship dynamic in which there's a reliance on the person, maybe temporarily, right? But the idea is to set people free so they can spread their own wings and become who they are most fully.
get to that first step, get grounded, get the guidance, and then jump. Take the leap.
Yeah, and hopefully when you're ready.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
right.
don't jump too soon, right? And then
Yeah.
all of those, but like guidance, support, but empowerment means coming into your own as a human being, as a
Right.
as a formed, wise person who knows when they need to ask help, but who also has that deep wellspring within.
Okay. And your book will do that. It will provide that
Yes, my book is a
empowerment.
step in that direction. I don't want to again, I could not possibly, after all we've talked about, say simply read my book and you'll be no. It's a journey. It takes work. My book
Right.
is a great start, but if you like the book and you see teachings or teachers in there you want to connect with, you want to find a guide, I am available. But there's good guides out there. I would say my book is a step in that direction, and it's also very much for someone who already feels empowered and feels spiritually alive
Yeah.
and wants to learn the Kabbalistic symbolic language of spirituality and transformation and all of that. It's a wonderful resource for connecting with ancestry or just that yearning to find out about that lineage, whether you're Jewish in your ancestry or not. It's like a gateway into that world.
A first step. Yeah. Okay, that's fantastic. And where can they get it? Do you have a website?
So
Are you
yeah,
getting
I
it
have a
through
website.
Amazon?
Yes, it's on Amazon. My website is matthewponak.com, MatthewPonak.com. I also have Embodied Kabbalah. I'm sure you'll share that in your
Yeah.
resources, but
You'll
just to
have that.
say,
Yeah.
it's you can buy the book electronically on my website or on Amazon or really any local bookstore. Pretty much seems to be able to order them in. And so
Yeah.
there's all the purchasing options are available on my website.
Awesome. Very good. Well, I look forward to it. It seems like something that I could read a page a day or
Oh
something like that, where I could dwell
a
on the.
page a day for 42 days is
Yeah.
amazing practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, what a journey.
Something
And
like
you could
that would be
also
really
flip it
wild.
open and just see what is revealed to you. It's one of those books. It doesn't need to go in order.
Yeah, those are great. Yeah. And it's deep wisdom and knowledge that you can really glean from it. With
Absolutely.
guidance.
Yes. Well, no, and the goal for some people who've reviewed my book say I'm not trying to uh dramatize or sell the
Yeah.
tradition. It's really letting the text speak for themselves is the goal. Engaging with it. What ideas arise in your mind while you're reading it? That's part of the practice. Like, what is there inspiration that comes? That's it. It's not. I'm not trying to dress it up. It's actually I'm trying to reveal it and
Right.
let it speak for itself and just see what's arising. The best thing I can do here is to empower the text to speak for
Yeah.
themselves.
There you go. Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for being here today. It's been a great talk.
Thank you.
Could do it again for sure.
Absolutely.
I'll dig into this book and I'll report back. We'll
Yeah,
have some more
sounds
to
good.
talk
Yeah, please
about.
let me
Yeah,
know. Take a look.
fantastic. Well, enjoy dinner and
Thank you.
until next time.